The lawyer read the will in a voice flat enough to make an insult sound like arithmetic. The house went to the son. The savings went to the son. And to the daughter, the lawyer said, came a tool shed on County Road 9, appraised at $5 plus one rusted key that no longer looked like it belonged to anything worth locking. Margaret Colson did not cry in that office. She had learned long ago that her father's silences meant more than most men's speeches, and this was a silence he had left on purpose. Somewhere between the gravel and the dirt, past the mailbox with his handwriting scratched into the metal, stood a building he had asked for by name. Not the house, not the money, but a $5 shed nobody else had wanted. What waited inside had been kept, not abandoned. A new brass lock gleamed against a door swollen shut with age, oiled by hands that had visited more recently than anyone in that family cared to admit. Some buildings rot when they're forgotten. This one had been guarded. Beneath its floorboards lay a silence old enough to have outlived the man who built it. A silence made of tin and cedar and paper gone soft at the folds, holding more than one daughter's inheritance ever should have weighed. It would take a pry bar, a bled knuckle, and a letter written years in advance to say what her father never could out loud. This is the story of a shed worth nothing on paper, a fortune buried in plain sight, and a promise handed down not in money, but in the quiet, unglamorous work of finishing what a good man started. The office of Beckett and Sons Estate Law smelled like burnt coffee and toner. Margaret Colson sat in a vinyl chair across from a metal desk, her coat still buttoned, a manila folder unopened in her lap. It was Tuesday afternoon, the 11th of March, and outside the window, a plow truck scraped down Main Street in Fenimore, throwing salt against the curb. She had driven 40 minutes to hear a document read aloud that she could have read herself in 5 minutes, but that was how her father had wanted it. Attorney Don Halverson cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before he started, the kind of man who read wills the way other men read grocery lists. Her brother Ricky sat 2 chairs down, one ankle crossed over his knee, checking the clock on the wall more than the papers in front of him. He had already told her in the parking lot that he expected the house, since he was the one who'd stayed local, the one who'd mowed their father's lawn on Saturdays. Margaret hadn't argued. She had left Fenimore at 18 and built a life 2 hours south in Madison, and some part of her had already made peace with getting nothing at all. Halverson read through the small bequests first. $300 to the volunteer fire department. $41 and change from a coin jar split between 2 grandchildren, a socket set to a cousin named Pete. Then came the house. 22 Birchwood Lane, appraised at $168,000 to Richard Colson, along with the balance of a savings account totaling $89,000. Ricky didn't smile, but his jaw loosened, the tension going out of it the way a man's shoulders drop when a job interview goes well. Margaret watched her brother's hands relax on his knees and felt nothing sharp about it, only a low, familiar ache, the kind you learn to carry without mentioning. She had expected her name to come up nowhere at all. Halverson turned a page and read on. To his daughter, Margaret Ann Colson, Walter Colson left the tool shed and adjoining half-acre parcel on County Road 9, assessed at a value of $5. The room went quiet enough that Margaret heard the furnace click on somewhere behind the wall. Ricky let out a short laugh, more surprised than cruel, and said he didn't even know the shed was still standing. Margaret asked Halverson to repeat the appraisal figure, certain she'd misheard, and he read it again without inflection, as if a $5 bequest were no stranger than any other line in the document. What Halverson said next was what stayed with her longest. Her father had come into the office 11 months before he died in April, specifically to add that clause, refusing to let his longtime attorney round the parcel into the general estate. He had insisted the shed go to Margaret by full name, not simply to his children jointly, and he had used the word specifically twice according to Halvorson's notes. He had also left one item to accompany the parcel, a single key, brass and worn, taped to an index card with her name printed on it in block letters. Halvorson slid it across the desk, and Margaret picked it up the way she might have picked up a bird that had struck a window, unsure whether it was still alive. Ricky wanted to know if there was anything else attached to the shed. Mineral rights, back taxes, a lien, anything that made $5 make sense as a number. Halvorson said the parcel was clean, the taxes current and paid every year without fail, a detail he mentioned almost as an afterthought while gathering his papers. Someone had been keeping that account square for a piece of land worth less than a fast food lunch. Ricky shrugged it off as their father's habit of not letting go of paperwork, the same reason he'd kept receipts for a lawnmower purchased in 1994. Margaret didn't share the shrug. She turned the key over between her fingers, feeling a groove worn into the teeth from years of use, not neglect. After the meeting, in the parking lot, Ricky offered to buy her out of her interest in the property for $200, more than double what it was worth on paper, mostly so he could say the estate was tidy before spring. Margaret said she'd think about it, which was not what she meant. She meant no, but she wasn't ready to explain why a $5 shed had lodged itself sideways in her chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. She had not thought about that shed in 20 years, not since she was a girl, trailing behind her father with a coffee can of nails, handing him whatever tool he called for before she knew the names of half of them. She drove home to Madison with the key sitting in the cup holder instead of her purse, glancing at it at every stoplight on Highway 18. Her father, Walter Colson, had been a deliberate man, a man who measured twice out of habit even when the cut didn't matter, and he had never in his life done anything as small as this without a reason folded up inside it. He had specifically asked for her name on that shed, not the house, not the savings. A $5 building on a half-acre no one had visited in years, and a key that had clearly been used more recently than that. That night she sat at her kitchen table with the index card propped against a coffee mug, reading her own name and her father's printing over and over, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into an explanation. She did not call Ricky back about the $200. She did not tell her husband what she was thinking, mostly because she wasn't sure yet herself. She only knew that somewhere off County Road 9, a shed with a swollen door and a $5 valuation was waiting on her, and that her father had made certain, with his last deliberate act on paper, that she would be the one to open it. Margaret went back to her father's house the following Saturday, telling Ricky she wanted to look through the garage before the estate sale company came to price everything. What she really wanted was the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, a gray metal 3-drawer unit their father had kept locked for as long as she could remember. Ricky had already found the key to it, tossed loose in a coffee can on the workbench, and he waved her toward it without much interest, more concerned with tagging power tools for the sale. She sat on the floor of that spare room for 3 hours, working through folders labeled in Walter's blunt, all-capital handwriting. Most of it was ordinary. Tax returns going back to 1981, warranty cards for a water heater, a folder simply marked truck containing every oil change receipt since 2003. But near the bottom of the second drawer she found a spiral notebook, the cardboard cover soft and gray from handling rubber banded shut. Inside were columns of dates, dollar amounts, and initials, no names, just letters, 2 or 3 at a time, next to numbers ranging from $9 to as much as $1,100. There was no ledger heading, no explanation, just page after page of entries stretching back nearly 30 years. The ink, changing from ballpoint blue to a cheap gel pen somewhere around the middle. She recognized her father's habit of abbreviation from his other paperwork, but these initials matched no one in the family. RT appeared 6 times over 4 years, with amounts climbing from $40 to $300. JH showed up only once, next to a figure of $1,100 underlined twice. Near the most recent pages, dated within the last 2 years, she found a set of initials that made her sit back on her heels. EW, beside a note that simply said roof and an amount of $600. She had no idea who EW was, but the handwriting told her this had mattered enough to underline. Tucked between the last 2 pages of the notebook was a photograph, its corners soft and rounded from being handled, likely tucked in a wallet at some point before it ended up here. It showed the Toolshed on County Road 9, considerably younger, its paint still a solid barn red instead of the gray it would fade to later. Her father stood in front of it with his arm slung over the shoulder of a man Margaret didn't recognize, both of them squinting against the sun, both holding coffee mugs like the photo had interrupted a conversation. On the back, in pencil, someone had written a date, July of 1994, and nothing else. She carried the notebook and photograph out to the kitchen where Ricky was wrapping a set of ceramic mugs in newspaper for the sale. She asked if he recognized the man in the photo, or knew anything about a ledger of initials and cash amounts. Ricky glanced at the picture for maybe 2 seconds before setting it face down on the counter and saying it was probably some old fishing buddy. The way Dad had dozens of them, nobody kept straight. He didn't ask to see the notebook again after the first look, more interested in whether the mugs were worth boxing separately or lumping into a general sale. Margaret didn't press him. She had learned a long time ago that her brother's disinterest wasn't cruelty, only a different shape of grief, one that wanted the estate closed and the house sold before summer. She brought up the shed again that afternoon, asking if he'd reconsider letting it sit unsold for a while instead of folding it into his $200 offer. Ricky said he genuinely didn't care either way, that the shed wasn't worth the gas it would take to drive out and look at it, let alone worth arguing over. He reminded her that their father had been sentimental about strange things toward the end, a coffee can, a specific hammer, a rain gauge nailed to the porch post since the 70s, and that this was probably no different. Margaret wanted to believe that. It would have been easier to believe that, in fact, than to sit with the alternative, which was that her father had built something out on County Road 9 that none of them had ever been let in on. That evening, she photographed every page of the notebook with her phone before returning the original to the filing cabinet, unwilling to explain to Ricky why she wanted to keep it separate from the estate paperwork. She sat at her father's kitchen table, the one with the cigarette burn on the corner from an uncle long since passed, and studied the numbers again under the overhead light. Whatever the ledger tracked, it wasn't debts owed to her father. Most of the entries showed no repayment, no second column marked paid. It read instead like a record of money going out, quietly, to a rotating cast of initials over 3 decades, with no accounting for why. She thought about her father as she'd known him, a man who wore the same style of Carhartt jacket for 40 years, who fixed his own truck rather than pay a shop, who split every restaurant check down to the dollar out of habit rather than stinginess. That man did not seem, on the surface, like someone who gave away thousands of dollars without record of return. And yet the record existed, kept as carefully as his oil change receipts, hidden in the same drawer, treated with the same quiet discipline he applied to everything else in his life. Whatever he'd been doing, he hadn't wanted it stumbled upon by accident, and he certainly hadn't wanted it explained by Ricky's shrug. Before she left the house that night, Margaret slipped the photograph of the shed into her coat pocket, the version of it healthy and red-painted, a version that no longer matched whatever waited for her out on County Road 9. She thought of the key still sitting in her cup holder, worn smooth at the teeth from a use that made no sense for a $5 building nobody visited. Her father hadn't been careless with that shed. He had been careful with it in a way that mattered enough to hide from his own children, careful enough to keep records nobody living was meant to find, until he'd chosen the moment. Whatever waited behind that swollen door, it wasn't nothing, and it wasn't an old man's sentiment over a coffee can. It was a debt her father had built somewhere out past the pavement, and now, without asking her, he had made her the one to finish paying it. Margaret waited 2 weeks before she drove out to County Road 9, telling herself it was because of work, though the truth was closer to fear of what she might find, or worse, what she might not. She left Madison before 7 on a Saturday morning at the end of March, coffee in the cup holder beside the brass key, a crowbar and a flashlight thrown in the back seat of her Subaru, almost as an afterthought. Her husband Dale had offered to come along, and she'd told him no, gently, in a way that surprised her, even as she said it. This felt like something she needed to walk into alone, the way her father had walked into that lawyer's office alone 11 months before he died to make sure her name was the one written down. The highway out of Madison ran smooth and wide for the first 30 minutes, past exits for gas stations and a Culver's and a billboard for a car dealership in Platteville. Then the exit for Fenimore came and went behind her, and the road narrowed into 2 lanes bordered by fence posts leaning at odd angles, fields still brown and hard from winter. She passed a grain elevator with Coulson Feed painted on its side, in letters faded to almost nothing. A business that had belonged to her grandfather and closed before she was born. 20 more minutes brought her past the edge of what still counted as town, houses spacing out until there were only fields and the occasional barn standing at a distance from the road. The pavement gave out just past a rusted grain silo with no name on it, the asphalt crumbling into a shoulder of loose gravel that rattled under her tires. Her phone lost signal somewhere in that stretch, the little bars blinking out one at a time until the screen just showed a circle with a line through it. She slowed the car without meaning to, the way a person slows when the road itself seems to be asking something of them. Sumac grew thick and red-brown along both ditches, and here and there a mailbox leaned so far sideways it nearly touched the weeds, most of them unmarked. One wrapped entirely in a plastic feed bag against the weather. County Road 9 wasn't marked with a proper street sign anymore. What remained was a bent metal post with a rectangle of green paint still clinging to it, the numbers scraped away by rust and time. Legible only if you already knew what you were looking for. Margaret slowed to a crawl and turned onto a track that could no longer honestly be called gravel. More dirt with occasional stones worked up through it, ruts on either side deep enough to catch a low car if she didn't stay centered. Queen Anne's lace and wild aster crowded in from both sides, brushing against her mirrors, closing the road down to barely 1 car's width. The trees overhead, mostly box elder and a few old oaks, had grown enough in 20 years to form a rough canopy, dimming the morning light to something dappled and green. She drove that half-mile at 10 miles an hour, the car pitching over ruts, gravel popping under the tires like distant firecrackers. Twice she had to stop and back up to avoid a low branch that had grown across the path since whoever last drove it through. The world outside her windshield narrowed the farther she went, fields disappearing behind a wall of brush, until the only thing visible ahead was more dirt track curving gently to the left around a stand of sumac. It felt less like driving somewhere and more like being slowly swallowed, the modern world folding up behind her 1 gravel pop at a time. Almost a quarter-mile in, she nearly missed the turn entirely, distracted by a rut that threatened to catch her front tire. What stopped her was a mailbox, leaning at nearly 40 degrees, its metal flag long since rusted into place. Scratched into the side of it, not painted but carved with something sharp, were 4 letters. Coulson. The scratches were old, the edges softened by weather. But someone had gone over them again at some point, the grooves too clean and too deep to be original, as if a hand had come back years later and retraced her father's name so it wouldn't disappear. She sat with the engine idling for a long moment before she turned in. There was no fence, no gate, just a slight widening of the dirt track where a vehicle might once have parked. Weeds grown up between old tire ruts that hadn't fully healed over. She could see nothing yet through the brush ahead, only more green and the suggestion of a clearing, a lighter patch of sky where the canopy thinned. Her hands were tight on the wheel in a way she hadn't noticed until she finally let go of it. Whatever waited beyond that mailbox had been marked, tended, and remembered by somebody, and it was not going to be nothing. Margaret cut the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. The only sound the tick of the cooling engine and a mourning dove somewhere off in the brush. She had driven 2 hours and 40 minutes from a life with 2 incomes, a mortgage, and a 15-year-old daughter waiting for the results of a track meet. And now she was parked at the edge of a road that barely qualified as a road, holding a key that had been used more recently than made any sense. She thought of her father's block letter printing on the index card, of the ledger with its rows of unexplained initials, of a photograph 20 years out of date tucked in her coat pocket. Somewhere past the tree line ahead of her stood the shed he had specifically asked to leave to her, and not to anyone else. She got out of the car, gravel crunching under her boots, and started walking the last stretch on foot, the brush closing in behind her like a door swinging quietly shut. The brush opened without warning, the way a hallway opens into a room, and there it stood. The shed was smaller than Margaret remembered, maybe 12 feet by 16, its board and batten siding gone the color of driftwood where the red paint from the photograph had weathered down to bare gray wood. The roofline sagged in the middle, a slow bow that spoke of a ridge beam, giving way inch by inch over decades, and one corner of the tin roof had lifted enough to show a triangle of daylight underneath. Waist-high grass and thistle had grown up around the foundation on 3 sides, thick enough that Margaret had to high-step through it to get close, her jeans catching burrs with every stride. It looked, from 30 feet away, exactly like what the will had called it, a $5 building nobody had wanted, but something didn't fit, and it took her a moment standing in the weeds to name what it was. The door was a heavy plank door, gray and split along one edge, hanging slightly crooked on hinges that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Bolted to that door, though, was a hasp and padlock that had no business being there. Brass, not the dull, tarnished brass of the key in her cup holder, but bright, faintly oiled, catching what little sun came through the canopy. The screws holding it to the wood weren't rusted at all. Someone had installed that hardware recently, on a building otherwise given over entirely to rot. And the contrast between the neglect and that one small gleaming detail stopped her cold in the grass. She stood there longer than she meant to, doing the math on it without wanting to. Her father had died the previous October, 11 months after amending his will to make sure this parcel came to her by name. If the hasp had been installed after that, it meant someone besides her father was still coming out here, still tending to a shed valued at $5 on a half-acre nobody visited. If it had been installed before he died, it meant her father himself had been out here recently enough to matter, driving that same swallowed-up dirt road well into his 70s for reasons he'd told no one. Either answer unsettled her in a different way, and she found she couldn't decide which one she was hoping for. She circled the building once before approaching the door, boots snapping through dead thistle stalks, one hand trailing along the siding, where the wood had gone soft and spongy near the base from years of rain wicking up from the ground. On the north side, a window had been boarded over from the inside, the plywood gray and swollen but intact. No gaps for raccoons or squirrels to have gotten in that way. A stovepipe jutted from the roof near the back corner, rusted through in one spot, but capped at the top with a piece of tin that looked hand-cut and fitted, not store-bought. Whoever had maintained this building had done it with the same deliberate, unhurried care her father brought to everything, measuring twice on a project nobody else would ever grade. She finally came back around to the door and crouched in front of the padlock, turning it over in her palm without yet trying the key. It was a master brand lock, the kind sold at any hardware store, no more than a year or two old by the shine still on the shackle. She thought again of the ledger entry for EW, and the $600 marked roof, wondering if this hasp and this lock were connected to that same handwriting, the same quiet upkeep that had kept the taxes paid without fail. Whoever EW was, they might know more about this building than Margaret did. And she made a note to ask, if she ever found the nerve to ask anyone at all. The brass key from the lawyer's office fit into the padlock's keyway with no resistance, sliding home the way a key does when it's been used often enough to wear its own path. She turned it, and the shackle popped free with a small, definite sound, cleaner than she expected from a lock exposed to Wisconsin winters. She lifted the hasp free of the staple and let the padlock hang loose, feeling the strange weight of having unlocked something for the first time in her life that had clearly been locked, and reopened many times before by someone else. The door itself was another matter. It had swollen into its frame with the kind of finality that comes from years of humidity and freeze-thaw, and it did not move when she pushed against it with her shoulder. She stepped back into the grass and studied the building again, this time the way her father might have, looking for what needed doing rather than what had already been done. The roof would need stripping and redecking before winter, if anyone cared to keep it standing that long. The window plywood would need to come off to see what state the glass and sash were in underneath. The stovepipe flashing had already failed once and would fail again without proper sealant. She catalogued the repairs almost without meaning to, the habit of a woman who had grown up handing her father tools by name long before she understood what half of them were for. A breeze moved through the canopy overhead, and somewhere behind her a branch cracked under its own weight, the sound sharp enough to make her turn. There was no one there, only the dirt track curving back the way she'd come, empty and quiet under the trees. She turned back to the door, flexing her fingers, feeling the old ache of a decision already made, though she hadn't spoken it aloud. Whatever her father had kept behind that swollen plank door, guarded by a padlock too new for the building it protected, she was not leaving County Road 9 without seeing it. She went back to her car for the crowbar. The crowbar was a 30-inch flat bar Margaret kept in her trunk for tire changes and the occasional stuck fence post, and she fit its beveled end into the gap between the door and the frame just above the lower hinge. She leaned into it slowly, testing the wood before committing her weight, the way her father had taught her to test ice on a pond before walking out onto it. The door groaned, but held. She repositioned the bar higher, near the latch side, and threw her full weight against it this time, feeling the swollen wood shift a fraction of an inch with a sound like a knuckle cracking. Sweat had already started at her hairline despite the cool March air, her breath coming out in short bursts of visible fog. If you have ever inherited more questions than answers from someone you loved, this is a good place to stop and subscribe, so you don't miss what Margaret found next. She worked the bar down the length of the frame in stages, applying pressure and easing off, applying and easing off, coaxing the door rather than fighting it outright. On the fourth attempt, something in the frame let go with a splintering pop, and the door swung inward 6 inches before catching on a buildup of leaves and dirt against the sill. She caught herself against the frame, breathing hard, and noticed a thin line of blood welling along the side of her palm where a rusted hinge screw had caught her skin. She pressed the cut against her jeans without much thought and pushed the door the rest of the way open with her shoulder, clearing the drift of leaves as she went. The air that met her was cool and still, thick with the smell of old motor oil, cedar, and mouse droppings, a smell that pulled her backward 30 years without warning. Dust hung visible in the shaft of light coming through the open door, drifting slow as the interior revealed itself in pieces. A workbench ran the length of the far wall, built from 2x4s and a plank top scarred with decades of saw cuts. A vise still clamped to one corner with its jaws rusted half shut. Above it, a pegboard held the ghost outlines of tools long since removed, painted silhouettes in a fading yellow marker that told her exactly where a hammer, a hacksaw, and a set of pliers had once hung. A coffee can sat on the corner of the bench, the Folgers label faded to pale blue, filled nearly to the top with bent and rusted nails sorted by nothing in particular. Margaret ran a finger along the edge of the workbench, and it came away coated in a fine gray dust, undisturbed in a way that told her no one had worked at this bench in years, whatever the padlock outside suggested. A tin advertisement for Red Man chewing tobacco hung crooked on a nail near the window, and beneath it, a calendar from a farm implement dealer. Its pages stopped on August of a year she couldn't quite make out through the grime on the glass frame around it. She stepped further inside, her boots landing on floorboards that gave slightly under her weight, a soft, spongy give that spoke of moisture working up from below for years without relief. Near the center of the room, 3 boards in particular flexed more than the others, a section roughly 2 feet by 3 that seemed to breathe under her steps like the deck of a boat. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the wood, feeling it shift almost imperceptibly, then knocked her knuckles against it the way her father used to knock on a wall stud before hanging a shelf. The sound that came back wasn't the dull thud of solid ground beneath. It was hollow. She fit the crowbar's flat end into the gap between 2 boards near the wall, where a rusted 8-penny nail had already worked most of the way loose from decades of settling. The board came up easier than the door had, a slow groan of old nails giving way rather than a fight, and she set it aside in the grass outside the doorway. A second board followed, then a third, each one revealing more of a shallow cavity dug into the earth beneath the shed's floor joists, lined at the edges with what looked like scrap cedar shim stock, fitted with more care than a hiding place ought to need. Margaret knelt at the edge of the opening, flashlight in hand, her breath coming shallow now for reasons that had nothing to do with exertion. The beam caught the corner of something dark green and stiff, a tarp folded over an object roughly the size of a bread box, tucked against the north joist where the ground stayed driest. She reached in and worked her fingers under the tarp's edge, feeling metal beneath the canvas, cold and slightly rusted at the seams. As she pulled it free of the loose dirt packed around it, something inside shifted with a small, definite clatter, and her fingers found a metal latch at the front, corroded but not frozen shut. She pressed her thumb against it and felt it give, a soft click swallowed almost entirely by the quiet of the shed, the kind of sound that seems small until it changes everything that follows it. She sat back on her heels in the dust and the cold, tarp-covered box balanced across her knees, her cut palm leaving a faint red smear against the green canvas. Somewhere outside, a mourning dove called twice and went quiet again, and the light through the doorway had shifted just slightly toward afternoon while she'd been working. She thought of the ledger entries, of the initials without names, of her father driving out this same swallowed road, long after his hands had started to shake with age. Whatever her hands were holding now, he had buried it deliberately, wrapped it carefully, and left the key to reach it in the hands of the one child he'd trusted to come looking. She lifted the lid the rest of the way, and the last of the daylight from the doorway fell across what was waiting inside. The tarp fell away to reveal a metal fishing tackle box, the kind with a fold-out tray, its latch the source of the click Margaret had felt beneath her thumb. Inside the top tray lay a scatter of small things that made no sense together at first glance. A folded stack of index cards bound with a rubber gone brittle and cracked, a coil of fishing line, and an envelope of cash held together with a paper clip that had rusted a faint orange stain into the bills. She counted it there in the dust. $340 in worn 10s and 20s. No note attached. No explanation beyond its own existence. Beneath the tray sat a dozen photographs curling at the edges, most showing her father standing beside people she didn't recognize in front of buildings that weren't this shed. She flipped through them slowly, boots aching from crouching, the cold from the dirt floor working up through her knees. One showed Walter Colson standing beside a much younger man in front of a gas station somewhere with a Sinclair sign overhead. both of them grinning like the photo had caught them mid-laugh. Another showed him at what looked like a church potluck, arm around a woman old enough to be somebody's grandmother, a casserole dish between them on a folding table. On the back of that one, in the same pencil hand as the shed photo from the filing cabinet, someone had written a single word: grateful. Margaret set the photographs down on the workbench in a neat row, unsure yet what they added up to, only certain that they added up to something. A sound outside made her go still, boots crunching through dead grass at a slow, unhurried pace that didn't belong to an animal. She stood and turned toward the doorway just as a man's silhouette filled it, backlit by the afternoon sun, tall and stooped in a way that spoke of decades of manual work. He raised one hand, not in greeting exactly, more the gesture of a man announcing himself before he startled someone. He said his name was Earl Whitfield, that he farmed the parcel adjoining this one, and that he'd seen her car parked at the mailbox and figured somebody ought to check. He was 78, he told her plainly when she asked, though nothing in the way he moved suggested it, setting down a battered thermos and a black rubber flashlight on the workbench without being invited to. He said he'd known Walter Colson going on 50 years, since they were boys running trot lines on the Grant River before either of them had a driver's license. Margaret asked carefully if he recognized any of the initials from the ledger she'd found, and Earl's eyes moved briefly to the tackle box on the floor, before he said only that Walter had always kept his own business to himself, and that was a habit worth respecting even now. He didn't offer more than that, and something in his face told her not to push. What he did offer, without her asking, was the flashlight sitting on the bench, saying the shed had never had electric run to it worth trusting, and she'd want better light than her phone by the time she got done poking around. Margaret reached for her wallet out of reflex, the same reflex her brother had when Earl had first spoken, an instinct to square accounts quickly and move on. She held out a $10 bill for the coffee he'd also produced from the thermos, 2 paper cups appearing from a jacket pocket like he'd expected to need them. Earl looked at the bill the way a man looks at an insect that's landed somewhere it shouldn't, and said he hadn't driven over to be paid for anything. He told her, while pouring coffee that smelled faintly of the percolator rather than a machine, that the wiring in the shed had gone bad sometime in the 90s, and Walter had never bothered running new Romex out to a building that only needed a single bulb. He said it the way a man reports a fact, rather than gives advice, no lecture in it, just information passed along because it might be useful. Margaret asked him outright if he'd installed the new hasp and padlock on the door, and Earl's mouth moved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more an acknowledgement that the question was fair. He said only that a building worth keeping was worth locking, and that Walter would have wanted it kept, whether or not it looked like much from the road. She wanted to ask him a dozen more things: who RT was, who JH was, why a $5 shed had a coffee cup casserole photograph inscribed with the word grateful. But Earl was already checking his watch, an old wind-up model with a cracked leather band, saying he had cattle to move before the light went. He told her, almost as an afterthought while turning toward the door, that if she needed a hand getting that roof stripped before the next rain, she should holler across the fence line rather than hire it out to somebody who'd overcharge her. Margaret said she would, meaning it more than she expected to when she said it. He was gone before she'd finished forming her next question, his silhouette shrinking back down the dirt track the way he'd come, unhurried, like a man who had somewhere to be but no urgency about getting there. She stood alone in the doorway a long moment, coffee cooling in her hand, listening to the sound of his boots fade into the general quiet of the woods. Whatever Earl Whitfield knew about her father's ledger, about the initials and the unexplained cash, he wasn't going to hand it over on a first visit, and something about that restraint made her trust him more rather than less. She turned back to the tackle box, to the photographs laid out in their careful row, to the coil of fishing line that seemed almost decorative next to everything else. $340 and a dozen photographs did not explain a $5 shed with a brass lock and 30 years of ledger entries. She looked again at the floorboards she'd already pulled, at the shallow cavity beneath them, and noticed for the first time that the cavity seemed to run deeper toward the back wall than she'd first accounted for, swallowed in shadow past the reach of her flashlight. Margaret set the coffee cup down on the workbench and returned to the opening in the floor, Earl's flashlight throwing a steadier beam than her phone had managed. The cavity did run deeper toward the back wall, just as she'd suspected, the joists casting a wedge of shadow that had hidden a full second compartment from her first pass. She pried up 2 more boards, the nails coming free with less resistance now that the wood around them had already been disturbed. Beneath them, set into a shallow trench lined with the same cedar shimstock, sat a military surplus ammunition box, olive drab paint chipped at the corners, a rope handle bolted to the lid. She lifted it out with both hands, surprised by the weight of it, and set it on the workbench beside the tackle box and its row of photographs. The latches had gone stiff with rust, but gave way under steady pressure, releasing with a stiffer, heavier sound than the tackle box's soft click. Inside, banded stacks of bills sat wrapped in plastic sandwich bags, the rubber bands around them brittle enough that one snapped as she lifted the first stack free. She counted it there on the workbench in the fading light, 20s and 50s mostly. A few older bills with the smaller portraits from decades back mixed in near the bottom. When she finished counting, the total came to $61,400, a number she said aloud to the empty shed, just to hear if it sounded as unlikely spoken as it had looked written on scraps of paper in her head. Beneath where the bills had sat, a stack of passbook savings booklets lay bound together with a rubber band that had somehow survived intact. Each one was issued from a bank in Fenimore that Margaret vaguely remembered closing sometime in the 2000s. The covers a faded institutional green, names on the front lines that meant nothing to her. She opened the top one and found a running column of small deposits. $5 here, $20 there. Spanning years, the interest calculated by hand in the same block printing she recognized from the index card in Halvorson's office. Whatever these accounts had been, they weren't her father's own savings. They looked instead like discipline applied on someone else's behalf, patient and small and constant. At the very bottom of the ammunition box, beneath the passbooks, sat a smaller tin, the kind that once held Christmas popcorn, its lid dented on one side as though it had been dropped once and never quite recovered its shape. Margaret worked the lid free with her thumbnail, feeling it give reluctantly, releasing a faint smell of old paper and machine oil. Inside lay a single envelope, cream-colored and gone slightly yellow at the edges, sealed with a strip of clear packing tape that had gone brittle and lifted at one corner. Her name was written across the front in her father's hand, no last name, just Margaret, followed by 4 words beneath it that stopped her breath in her chest. When she's ready. She didn't open it right away. She sat down on an overturned bucket near the workbench instead, the envelope balanced on her knee, and looked instead at everything spread out in front of her. The cash, the passbooks, the photographs of strangers she now understood her father had helped in ways none of his own children had ever known about. The light through the doorway had shifted low and gold, throwing long shadows across the dirt floor, and somewhere outside, a woodpecker worked steadily at a dead branch. She thought of Ricky's dismissal of the shed as worthless, of the $200 buyout offer sitting unanswered in her phone, and felt something close to relief that she hadn't said yes. She turned the envelope over twice in her hands before finally sliding a fingernail beneath the lifted corner of tape, working it loose with the same patience she'd used on the swollen door earlier that day. The tape gave with a soft tearing sound that felt enormous in the quiet of the shed. Inside, folded into thirds, was a letter written in the same block, printing as everything else her father had left behind, several pages thick, the paper soft from having been folded and unfolded more than once before. It was sealed here for good. She could see, without yet reading a word of it, that this was not a short note. This was something her father had taken his time over. She glanced at her watch and saw it was later than she'd realized. The drive home still ahead of her, Dale expecting her back before dark. But she also knew, sitting there on an overturned bucket with $61,400 counted out beside her, and a letter addressed to her alone still unread in her hands, that she was not leaving this shed until she'd read every word of it. She set the bucket closer to the doorway where the last of the daylight still reached, unfolded the first page, and began. The letter was dated the 14th of September, 3 years before he died, written in the same steady block printing he'd used his whole life, though here and there a letter wavered slightly, as if his hand had needed a moment before continuing. Margaret read it slowly in the gold light coming through the doorway, the shed quiet around her except for the woodpecker still working somewhere in the trees. It began plainly, the way he began. Most things. Dear Margaret, it read. If you're reading this, you've already been out to the shed, and you've already found more than a $5 building had any business holding. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was still able to say it out loud. Some things get harder to say the older you get, not easier, and this was one of them. I want you to sit down somewhere before you read the rest, though I expect you already are. Your grandfather taught me 2 things that mattered more than anything else he passed down. The first was how to fix what was broken instead of throwing it away, whether that was a tractor or a fence line or a man's bad luck. The second was that helping somebody properly means they never have to know where it came from. He used to slip cash into envelopes and leave them in mailboxes when the Kroll family's barn burned in 1962, and he never once let on it was him. Not even when Ed Kroll thanked the whole church for a miracle nobody could explain. I didn't understand it then. I understood it later. The initials in that notebook you found, if you found it, aren't a record of loans. Nobody paid any of it back, and nobody was ever meant to. RT was Ronald Truax, who lost his job at the tannery in '89 with 3 kids and a mortgage, and needed $300 more than he needed anybody knowing he needed it. JH was Janet Halloran, a widow 2 farms over, who nearly lost her land to the bank in '94 before $1,100 showed up folded inside a church bulletin. There are 40-some names in that notebook over 30 years, and every one of them still believes to this day that whatever help came their way was luck, or the church, or a stranger's guilty conscience. Let them keep believing that. It was never about being thanked. The shed was never really about tools, not after your grandfather passed. It became the place I came to think, to keep the books nobody else needed to see, and eventually to store what I couldn't keep in a bank without questions being asked. $61,400 is what's left after 30 years of doing this the slow way. $5 and $20 and sometimes a great deal more at a time, whenever the ledger and the season allowed for it. It isn't retirement money. It was never meant to sit still. I'm leaving it to you specifically and not to your brother, not because I love him less, but because you were always the one who noticed when somebody was struggling before they said a word about it. You get that from your grandmother, not from me. I'm not asking you to give this money away exactly as I did, in the same amounts to the same kind of trouble. I'm asking you to keep the shed standing, keep the roof over it, and keep an eye out the way this family always has, quietly, for whoever ends up needing it next. Earl Whitfield knows more about this than anyone left living, and he'll help you if you let him, though he won't offer more than you ask for. He's like that. He always has been. There is one more thing I should tell you plainly, since I'm running out of paper and courage in about equal measure. There may come a time when somebody shows up wanting that land for reasons that have nothing to do with kindness. A road gets built, or a quarry gets interested, or somebody decides a half-acre of scrub timber is worth more to them than it ever was to us. If that happens, don't let the number they offer be the only thing you weigh. This shed paid for itself a long time ago, in ways no appraisal will ever show on paper. I never said any of this to your face because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like a lecture. And you always deserved better than a lecture from your father. So I wrote it down instead, the way I write everything down. And I hid it where I knew you'd have to work for it. Because the things worth keeping are always the things you had to dig for. I'm proud of you, Margaret. I always was, even on the days I forgot to say it. Take care of the shed. Take care of whoever finds their way to it next. Love, Dad. Walter R. Coulson, September 14th. Margaret sat with the letter open on her knee for a long while after she finished it. The light through the doorway gone from gold to a deeper amber. The woodpecker finally silent. She did not cry. Not the way people cry in movies. Only pressed the back of her hand once against her eyes and left it there a moment before letting it fall. She folded the pages carefully along their old creases and held them against her chest with both hands, sitting very still on the overturned bucket while the shed settled quietly round her. Outside, the light kept sinking toward the tree line, and somewhere past the mailbox with her father's name scratched into the metal, the dirt road waited to carry her back to a world that knew nothing yet of what she'd found. The man showed up on a Thursday morning in early April, driving a clean pickup truck that had never once seen a dirt road as rough as County Road 9, parked carefully so as not to scratch the paint on the encroaching sumac. Margaret was up on the roof at the time, straddling a rafter, stripping curled tin with a flat bar, while Earl Whitfield steadied a ladder below her without being asked to. The man introduced himself as Roy Delaney, a land buyer working for a firm out of Madison that specialized, he said, in assembling rural parcels for eventual resale. He had a folder under his arm and a way of smiling that never quite reached the rest of his face, the kind of pleasant that costs a person nothing. He offered $31,000 for the half-acre, more than 6,000 times what the will had appraised it for, a number he delivered slowly enough to let it land on its own. He mentioned, almost gently, that he'd looked into the property's tax history and noticed a small discrepancy in a filing from years back. Nothing serious, he said, but the kind of thing that could get complicated and expensive if somebody with less patience than him decided to make an issue of it. Margaret climbed down from the roof rather than shout her answer from up there, wiping her palms on her jeans as she crossed the grass toward him. She told him she'd think it over, the same words she'd once given her brother, though this time she meant them. She didn't sleep well that night, not from fear exactly, more from the particular weight of a decision that wasn't only hers to make. She sat at her kitchen table with Delaney's card propped against the same coffee mug that had once held the index card with her name on it, and she thought about her father's letter, about the line concerning a road or a quarry or somebody deciding the land was worth more to them than it had ever been to the Coulsons. She called Halvorsen in the morning, and he confirmed within the hour that the tax discrepancy was nothing, a filing clerk's typo from 1991, corrected years ago and long since settled. Delaney had known that, most likely, and offered it anyway, the soft threat costing him nothing to make and her nearly a sleepless night to weigh. She called him back that Friday and told him no, plainly, without explaining herself further than she owed him. He took it evenly, said he understood, and told her the offer would stand if she ever changed her mind, in a tone that suggested he didn't expect her to and wasn't especially bothered either way. He got back in his clean truck and reversed carefully down the dirt track, and Margaret stood at the mailbox and watched him go until the brush swallowed the taillights whole. Earl, who'd come over uninvited the moment he heard tires on the gravel, said only that Delaney would be back around in a year or two trying somebody else's patience, and that this was simply how men like that spent their time. The roof took most of April to finish properly, Earl showing up 2 or 3 mornings a week with tools Margaret hadn't thought to bring and knowledge she hadn't thought to ask for. They stripped the old tin down to bare decking, replaced 2 rotted rafters with pressure-treated lumber, and laid new standing seam panels that caught the sun in a way the shed hadn't managed in 30 years. She ran new Romex out from a junction box Earl helped her wire off his own meter, bringing real light into the building for the first time since the 90s. A single bulb over the workbench that Walter Colson had once done without. She replaced the swollen plank door with a new one built from cedar, hanging true on new hinges, closing with a soft, satisfying click instead of a groan. By the second week of May, she'd made her first deposit into an account she'd opened under her own name, separate from her household finances, funded from a portion of what the ammunition box had held. She kept the notebook going in the same spiral style her father had used, though she wrote in her own hand now, tracking not loans but gifts, the way he'd asked her to in his letter. Her first entry went to a young mother 2 towns over who'd lost her apartment in a fire. An amount of $200 slipped anonymously through a church food pantry, the way her grandfather once had through mailboxes. She didn't tell Ricky about any of it, not because she meant to keep him out, but because some things, as her father had written, were never about being thanked. She kept the mailbox at the end of the track, scratches and all, but she went out one Saturday with a fine point marker and traced over the letters of Colson where the rust had started eating into the grooves again, making certain the name would hold a little longer. Beneath it, in smaller letters, she added nothing at all, deciding some things didn't need a second name attached to carry forward. The shed itself she left mostly as it was, weathered gray siding intact, new roof gleaming where the old one had sagged, workbench cleared of dust but otherwise unchanged, pegboard silhouettes still marking where tools used to hang. She hung a few new tools of her own in their place, filling in the ghost outlines her father had left behind. On a warm evening in late May, Margaret sat on the shed's front step with a cup of coffee going lukewarm beside her, watching the last light slide sideways through the trees the way it had the first day she'd come out here alone. A truck she didn't recognize slowed at the end of the track, pausing near the mailbox the way hers had once paused, uncertain of the turn. It idled there a long moment before pulling in, a young man behind the wheel looking lost in the particular way of someone who has driven farther than he meant to and isn't sure why. Margaret set her coffee down and stood, unhurried, the way Earl once had, and walked out to meet him at the mailbox without yet knowing what he needed. Whatever waited beneath a person's floorboards, her father had written once, mattered less than what they chose to do once they'd found it. The light kept falling soft and gold across the clearing, the new tin roof catching the last of it in a long, quiet gleam, and the shed stood exactly where it always had. $5 on paper, and worth more than that to everyone who'd ever needed it.